Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. This week, we have with us Stacey Taurah. Hey, Stacey, welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to be here.
Absolutely, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Stacey is a seasoned Agile coach with, and I love this part, a squiggly line into tech and delivery, from forensics to frameworks and all that's in between. Stacey, that was a short intro. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how did you end up becoming a Scrum Master?
Okay, so I've been in the field of sort of Scrum Mastery, delivery, Agile coaching, whatever you want to call it, for around 6 or 7 years. I've worked with various companies, started around the scientific side of things. So I actually have a degree in forensic scientist where I was a DNA expert for about 6 years. And this kind of leads into quite nicely about how I became a Scrum Master and the squiggly element that was in the introduction as well. So I started out working in DNA, and I've always had a passion for facts and metrics. But another side of me is I've always been very people conscious around sort of the impact that we have with language that we use, the psychological elements of things. So when I was in my DNA role, we have to change a number of things on our software to push it to the National DNA Database. And we have to make sure that we meet accreditation. There is strict sort of like rules and gates that we need to go through. And if that sort of success drops a little bit, then we don't look like the best sort of company for the police to choose. So it's very, very important that we're up there. So I decided to ask our one developer, before you push anything live, can I have a little play with it first, please? Just to make sure that everything works. It was a really old system. It was a LIMS system. It wasn't greenfields. And it was one of those things that if you placed a checkbox over here, something completely unrelated would break over here. So I wanted to make sure that end-to-end user journey was a success. So I started, what I didn't know at the time was testing. So I had a little play to make sure if I could break it. After a while, I showed that there was value in that role, and I wanted to sort of challenge it a little bit more and be a little bit more curious in the world of testing. And I literally Googled paid to test things. And because I didn't know it was a job. I didn't know. So found out that was a role. I went to another scientific company that was based around mass spectrometry, which kept me in touch with science, but also moved me a little bit closer to the tech world. And I was taken on as a manual tester. And this was a number of years ago, where testing was done at the end. It's not, but it was done at the end. And because of my vibrancy, being sort of like young and chatty and bubbly, and being in the tech industry when I first moved into it, we did have the stereotypical sort of, everyone was a middle-aged man. That is moving now, thankfully, gratefully.
It's very different in many companies these days.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But then I was the sort of the wrangler of getting everyone together. So the company decided to look at Agile. I was a fit for the Scrum Master, and I ended up being a Scrum Master because I had nothing to do for 8 days of the sprint. so I could
yes,
get
because at that time, that's how testing was done, right? Like the 2 days before delivery.
Yeah, throw it over the line, click it. And automation wasn't a thing back then either.
I remember developers asking the testers, so do you think you can test it by tomorrow? And the testers, of course, had not even seen it.
Yeah. I know. There was no discussions about like story breakdowns, what test implications were needed, what even needs. You'd be sat there going, I don't even know what the feature is. What even is it?
Good old times, the good old times. These days, of course, it's totally different. So for those of you listening who might not have experienced, there are many companies out there where the testers are an integral part of everything that happens every day, right? It's not testing at the end anymore.
Evolved, isn't it? It's the way that it's evolved now, isn't it? And it's the way that it should be. We talk about T-shaped people and single points of failure and everyone having the same input into the work. I mean, how do you test something that you don't know? And similarly, how do you develop something if you don't know how it's going to be tested or it's going to be used? So in the system nowadays, hopefully, lots of companies are looking at the whole system thinking approach rather than having segregated disciplines.
Yeah, I'll put the link in the show notes, but there's a whole movement in testing, shift left, or shift left testing, which is, of course, talking about moving testing earlier in the stages of development.
Yeah.
And I remember in one of the companies where I worked, where we tried to get testing to be done at requirements phase. This was way back when, even before Scrum, but we were already at that time trying to get testers to test the requirements. Of course, they would do that in many different ways. The most obvious would be to read the documents and give feedback, but also to assess, how testable this is and things like that. Because today is Monday, I don't know if you're going to tell us a story about when you were a tester or a Scrum Master, or if it has anything to do with testing, but we want to explore one of those stories of failure because, of course, we all learn from those stories. So, Stacey, tell us that story.
So for me, and it may be sort of a little bit deviating away from a specific moment in time where I failed and something didn't work. It's a little bit more holistic, but I think it would be really helpful for people to hear the mindset shift that came from it. So it was while I was a Scrum Master. So in my career, I'd always been defined as a role. It was either you were a DNA expert or you were a tester. And then as a Scrum Master, I was like, I'm a Scrum Master. Brilliant. I can recite anything that's needed around Scrum. I can tell you what's in the manifesto. I could literally reel everything off. I went and did my training. I got the certification, and I was like, great, I'm done. I can do Scrum Mastery. And to me, that was one of my mistakes. That I was just sort of like.
So tell us a little bit more about that, because of course there's a lot of anecdotes, I imagine, related to that. So you had that mindset, right? Like, I know what's in the book, so I can do it.
Yeah,
but then you went into practice. So tell us one example of how that started to become a little bit of an impediment for you.
So I was in a team space, and I'd been very comfortable, and I had my boundaries. As with anybody, like, change didn't sit well with me. I wasn't used to it, even though it is one of the ethoses that we need to be very good in this role. We need to be able to change and reflect and understand where we are on the change curve. And I was just comfortable with, okay, we went into sprint planning. We story pointed. If we didn't, I would force people to story point because I needed numbers and I needed them in Jira because that's what we did. And it was just something that just didn't work. We would come up against ideas where we weren't too sure what the work was, or we didn't have enough requirements, or we had this like backwards and forwards about whether we needed to do a proof of concept of things. I'm like, yeah, but we need to story point it because we need to estimate. And this is where I'm really annoyed with myself for not learning quicker, is not to settle with what you are told. Just because there are boundaries, it doesn't mean you stay in the box. So I've taken that forward. If I'm in a team where, to me, something like estimation, which is, I was like, no, we need numbers in boxes and Jiras because we need to report, and someone says they need a report. Now, if somebody wants a report, I've taken that learning and that understanding, because it didn't affect the delivery of the team. Whether I'm in team A, team B, team C, to me, the goals were, for example, that specific one around estimation and using the tool. It was, are we having the right conversations? Well, they weren't. The conversations were stopping because I was forcing them to give me a number, an arbitrary number, but to the point that people were closing down, which is not inclusive. It's not, that takes away from the Scrum pillars of around transparency, inspection, adaptation. Because I'm saying, you must give me this. And then nobody wanted to talk in case it was wrong. And I'm really annoyed at myself for working that way.
I actually wanted to take that topic further. So many of our listeners are out there probably doing the exact same thing you were doing back then, right?
Yeah.
And of course they listen to you and say, oh, but what does she mean, right? Like,
what does she mean? Yeah.
Yeah, because one thing is to know what the rules are, and the other thing is to know how to apply them, right? Like, for 100%. Example, a beginner, an apprentice carpenter will probably know how to build a chair, but they will not know what chair to build, right?
Yes.
So, and I think that what you're reflecting, which is, I understand your frustration and impatience at the time, right? Coming out in that annoyance that you were describing. But we need to also be patient ourselves with the fact that we are still learning how to apply. I mean, even today, I'm still learning how to apply the things I learned when I 100%. Became a Scrum Master. So walk us through that reflection, because I think it's important to understand not that it took time, because it does, but rather 100%. What were the triggers? What were the catalysts for you to really shift your mindset regarding those rules?
I think watching people's behavior while I was trying to enforce rules. And then also because of my scientific background and the way that sort of like I validate things to myself, I actually took, when I saw that behavior change, people sort of closing down and not being open, and there was only one person speaking in the room because of the situation that I'd caused because I was driving to an arbitrary figure. I actually went away and I looked at the story points that we delivered, the stories that we delivered, looked at the cycle time of those and mapped them to each other and sort of understood in that situation, did the numbers matter as much as what I thought they did? And it turned out they didn't. They were very, very similar. Whether something was a 3 or something was an 8, the cycle time was very similar. And I wanted to capture that and focus on that more. And I wanted to change my questioning, but I needed that numerical validation for myself to know, right, yeah, no, you've got this. Like, if you want to help these people and you want to be inclusive and you want to share this knowledge, it's not about a tool, it's about the people. The tool comes after. The tool for me, and it always has been now, is something that complements and heightens the situation that you're in. It's not a thing that you do. And if we go back to the simplistic elements of, if we weren't working remotely now, we were all still in offices and we were doing what things were right at the very beginning, well, we'd have a Post-it note and we'd be writing on it. We wouldn't be, there's this field here that we need to fill in and this field here that we need to fill in. The tool's there to complement. The tool shouldn't design your process. So yeah, to me, I know I've got to round the houses about this, but yeah, it was, I needed to make sure that I was allowing these people to be the experts in their field and that they weren't just succumbing to what I was saying because I needed to put it in a tool.
Absolutely. I like how you said that the tool doesn't define the process. The tool must, of course, follow whatever the process is that we end up deciding. And the other tip that you mentioned, which I wanted to highlight, is to observe people's behavior as you enforce certain rules, because we don't enforce rules we don't believe are necessary, right? So, and that's one of the things, like, I understand the impatience and frustration coming out in that annoyance, but I have to highlight for our listeners that we need to be empathetic with ourselves. And if we feel frustrated for not having learned quickly enough, that's a great sign. That's a sign, first, that we've recognized we needed to learn. And second, we went through a process of kind of finding, like, what's the reason I need to learn? Like you were describing, right? Like I didn't just trust the observation of people closing up. I actually went and looked at the numbers and finally figured out that actually the numbers are not that relevant.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's like true, like with the learning side of things, like we do need to be kinder to ourselves when we learn. There's this whole statement of fail fast, and I really, really hate it. I hate the statement. It's not about failure, because failure means that we are doing something and we failed. There's that feedback loop that's missing. It's not. It's about learn fast. And even then, it's learn at your own pace. It's learn at the situational time that's needed.
So I once learned this, and I wanted to highlight that from what you just said. Fail can be looked at as an acronym. And if we do so, it can be translated to first attempt in learning.
Learning, yeah.
So let's take that. That's a great takeaway. Focus on learning. Thank you very much for that, Stacey.
You're welcome.
Monday is about what we learn from our obstacles and our failures. But tomorrow is Team Tuesday here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. We explore teams and their journeys, the habits they develop that threaten their performance, how each of our guests help their teams evolve, and the one key lesson they learned from that experience. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.